Blood trickled down the boy's knee, bright and fresh against the gray concrete of Manhattan's Upper East Side. The sky loomed heavy and sullen, swollen with clouds that had yet to burst, mirroring the tension that hung in the air. No one stopped. No one looked. To the polished shoes rushing past, he was just another noise, a child's cry unremarkable amid honking horns, shouting vendors and the hum of expensive engines. A speck of disorder in the immaculate order of wealth. But to Zoe, that cry sliced through her like glass. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her legs ached from sleeping upright, wedged between a dumpster and a brick wall in a narrow alley behind a Chinese takeout. Her stomach grumbled violently, but it was that small, wet sob that made her move, not for food, not for shelter, but toward a child she didn't know. "Hey there, little one," she murmured gently, crouching beside the boy. Her voice was worn and soft, like corduroy rubbed thin. The boy sniffled, clutching his scraped knee with trembling fingers. His blonde curls were tousled. His khaki shorts were dusted with grit. He looked about 6. "Let me take a look," she said, reaching into the inside pocket of her worn coat, the only possession she'd kept from her old life. She pulled out a neatly folded white handkerchief, clean, pressed, and incongruously elegant, and dabbed at the wound. From across the street, a tall man in a sharp navy suit stood frozen. Richard Montgomery, billionaire founder of Montgomery Enterprises, clutched the handle of his $5,000 leather briefcase with white knuckles. His eyes were fixed on the woman tending to his son. Her hands, dark, calloused, scarred, were touching Noah's pale skin. Normally, security would have intervened. Anyone from the street who so much as looked at Noah would be removed. But today, Richard was alone, deliberately so. After 3 months of jetting between boardrooms in Tokyo, Riyadh, and London, he had insisted on spending the day with his son. Just him and Noah. No staff, no bodyguards. Now his son sat calmly as a homeless woman cleaned his knee with the gentleness of a nurse. Richard didn't move. He didn't know why. "Looks like you were in a hurry," said Zoe, smiling slightly, tying Noah's shoelaces with nimble fingers. "I wanted to see the birds," he said, pointing at a gang of pigeons pecking at breadcrumbs. "They were fighting." Zoe laughed softly, the sound dry but sincere. "Well, next time, watch where you're flying." The boy giggled. "I'm Noah." "Nice to meet you, Noah. I'm Zoe." It was the first time anyone had asked for her name in months. Zoe's smile revealed surprisingly white teeth. Her skin, though weathered, glowed with resilience. She smelled faintly of lavender soap, the kind handed out at shelters on Wednesdays. Richard took a slow breath. His son had stopped crying. She'd done what expensive nannies, child psychologists, and elite tutors had failed to do with such ease, calmed Noah with a touch and a joke. "You okay now?" Zoe asked, dabbing at the last trace of blood. "It's not too bad. You'll be chasing pigeons again in no time." Noah nodded, but then his small face wrinkled with confusion. He tilted his head. "Why are you so dirty?" The question hung in the air like a gunshot. Richard flinched, shame prickling the back of his neck. He stepped forward, mouth half open, to apologize, to scold, to do something, but Zoe beat him to it. She didn't flinch. "Because not everyone is as lucky in life, little one," she said, voice calm and steady. "Sometimes people lose their homes, or their jobs, or their family, but that doesn't mean they're bad. It just means they're going through something hard. But we never lose our humanity unless we choose to." The words hit Richard in the chest like a hammer. Just a month ago, in a boardroom surrounded by suits and cigars, he had smugly declared that the homeless chose their circumstances and that handouts were a moral hazard. Now he was staring at a woman who owned nothing, not even a roof, sharing the only clean item she had with. The following morning, the city stirred awake with its usual frenzy, caffeine-fueled suits pouring out of subways, horns blaring in traffic jams, and dogs barking at nothing. But in a penthouse that towered over Madison Avenue, a billionaire sat unusually still. Richard Montgomery had canceled all meetings. No conference calls, no stock updates, no venture briefings. Instead, he stood before a high-tech facial recognition system, uploading security footage from nearby traffic cameras and satellite access, tools typically used to hunt corporate spies or track down offshore hackers. But today, they were used to find a woman with no digital footprint, Zoe Williams. He didn't even know her full name, just a voice, a presence, a look in her eyes that haunted him. And the handkerchief. Richard couldn't sleep the night before. The image of Zoe's trembling hands holding Noah's leg, the calm in her voice when she answered his innocent question, it had played over in his mind like a looping confession. He had been raised to believe that weakness lived in the streets, that poverty was a symptom of laziness, that kindness, when not profitable, was a flaw. But something about that woman shattered all of it. And so he searched. Meanwhile, across town, Zoe stood in line at the now overcrowded St. Brigid shelter, her body soaked from a morning rainstorm. Her shoes were near collapse, her coat reeked faintly of mildew, but she smiled as she reached the front. Only to hear, "We're closing, effective immediately." "What?" she said, stunned. "There's an emergency order. The city's clearing this block for renovations. You've got 20 minutes to grab your things." Zoe blinked. "Where are we supposed to go?" A police officer shrugged without looking at her. The line behind her erupted into panic. Elderly men with walkers, single mothers gripping children, veterans with haunted eyes, everyone shouting. No one heard. Zoe didn't scream. She didn't protest. She simply turned and walked. Rain soaked through her sleeves, but she didn't flinch. She walked aimlessly for hours, park benches, closed libraries, roped-off playgrounds. She ended up near an underpass, sitting with her backpack, the same one that now carried her entire life. 2 shirts, a cracked phone with no signal, a tattered makeup kit, and a spiral-bound journal. In the journal, names, faces, details, slights. Every microaggression she'd faced in job interviews, every rejection email with that vague phrase, "You're not a cultural fit." 3 years ago, she had a job, a future, a place to live, a stable mind. Now she had pages filled with truth. That was when someone tapped her on the shoulder. "Zoe." She looked up, startled. A short man in a red parka stood holding a clipboard and a warm smile. His name was Marcus, a caseworker she vaguely remembered from a housing program. "There's an opening at the Fresh Start Foundation. They're looking for people like you." She squinted. "What does that mean?" "People who've survived, who've seen it all, who understand how the system actually works." Zoe laughed dryly. "You want a homeless person to work for a nonprofit?" "I want you," he said, handing her a business card. "You have something the rest don't, dignity under pressure." Her hands trembled as she took the card. The next day, Zoe walked into the foundation's headquarters, dripping wet, her coat steaming on the polished floor of the lobby. The receptionist gave her a look that could cut glass. "Can I help you?" she asked with icy precision. "I'm here for the opening. Marcus sent me." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Do you have an appointment?" Before Zoe could answer, a sharp, elegant voice cut through the room. "She's exactly where she needs to be." Amara Chun. Impeccably dressed in a navy suit and flat shoes, the executive director of the foundation strode forward with purpose. She extended a hand, firm, unhesitating, authentic. Zoe blinked. No one had looked her in the eye that way in years. In Amara's modest office, there were no plaques or ego walls, just sticky notes, a well-used laptop, and a photo of a protest. We don't just rescue people here, we expose the rot that keeps them stuck. She handed Zoe. Zoe sat hunched over a folding desk in the back room of the Fresh Start Foundation, fingers cramping from scribbling. The hum of an ancient heater did little to chase the chill from the air, but she barely noticed. In front of her, testimonies, reports, interviews, and her own journal. But what connected them all was something more dangerous than outrage: patterns. The same corporate phrases, the same phrases repeated across hundreds of rejected applications, almost always targeting Black, brown, or visibly queer candidates. Not a cultural fit. Doesn't align with brand image. Lacks executive polish. Zoe had lived those words, tasted them in her mouth like ash, but now she saw the outlines of a lie too big to ignore. It wasn't accidental. It was orchestrated. And at the center of it all, sitting comfortably in his leather chair under a diversity and inclusion banner, was James Peterson, the same man who had once looked her in the eye and told her she wouldn't represent the company well. What Peterson didn't know was that she had recorded that interview, or that she kept the rejection letter, printed, dated, and stored carefully under the frayed lining of her backpack. What Peterson didn't know was that she had nothing left to lose. In a high-rise meeting room several blocks away, Richard Montgomery watched his company unravel from within. His executive assistant, pale and stiff, closed the door after delivering the latest memo. "We're being watched," she whispered. Richard stared at the boardroom wall, at the corporate mission statement embossed in gold. Integrity, progress, equity. A bitter laugh rose in his chest. What a lie! Ever since Zoe's name had surfaced again, not just in relation to Noah, but as the emerging face of a grassroots campaign shaking the city's corporate elite, Richard hadn't been able to think straight. He had read every article, watched every video, traced every lead. He knew she had joined the foundation. He knew she was preparing something big. But what he didn't know was how it would end. That night, Zoe rode the subway to the Bronx, seated across from a woman in a janitor's uniform, sobbing quietly into her lunch bag. "First, they let me in the door," the woman said, tears dripping onto her half-eaten sandwich. "Then they remind me every day that I don't belong." Zoe took her hand. "You do," she said. "You just scare them." One story became 20. 20 became 100. Patterns became proof. The city's most prestigious company, the one whose CEO's child she had once bandaged with trembling hands, had built an empire not just on innovation, but on exclusion. And now she had the evidence. Meanwhile, in his office lined with oil paintings and investment trophies, Richard stared at an image of Zoe on his monitor. The photo was grainy, taken from a security camera outside the foundation, but it was unmistakable. The same scarf, the same coat, the same fire in her eyes. Noah called her the Scarf Lady. Richard now called her something else in his mind. The Reminder. She reminded him of everything he had ignored, everything he had built walls to avoid. And worst of all, she reminded him that he had once been proud of those walls. He turned to the door. "Get me the full transcript of Peterson's diversity reports," he told his assistant. "But sir, those are—" "I know exactly what they are. That's why I need them." 3 days later, Zoe received an email she didn't expect. Subject line: Panel invitation, Montgomery Enterprises Annual Inclusion Forum. She stared at it for a long time. An invitation to speak, to be seen, by the same company that once buried her alive. Was it a trap? Amara thought so. Marcus was skeptical. But Zoe only said one thing. The chaos backstage was instant. Executives huddled in circles, phones lit up with calls from PR teams, assistants whispered into earpieces. The Montgomery Enterprises Annual Inclusion Forum, once a carefully choreographed display of virtue signaling, had imploded under the weight of a truth bomb dropped live on stage. And at the center of the storm stood Zoe Williams, unmoved, composed, calm. As Richard Montgomery approached her through the flurry of camera flashes and urgent footsteps, she instinctively stepped back, her body tense. "Miss Williams," he began, voice lower now, rawer. "Do you have a moment?" Zoe looked him in the eye. His expression was unguarded, almost pleading, and entirely unlike the confident titan she had imagined all this time. "I'm not here for a photo op," she said flatly. "I know. This isn't about that. It never should have been." She paused. He gestured toward a hallway off to the side, away from the crowd. Reluctantly, she followed. Inside a quiet conference room, far from the noise, they sat across from one another. For a full minute, no one spoke. Zoe's hands were folded over her lap. Richard's fingers tapped lightly on the table, the first sign of the nervous energy barely held beneath his tailored suit. "Noah asks about you almost every day," he said finally. Zoe blinked. "He calls you the scarf lady," Richard added, smiling faintly. "He remembers everything, the birds, the knee, your handkerchief." She hadn't expected that. "I've been looking for you, not to stop you, not to silence you, but because that day, when you helped him, it changed me." Zoe raised her eyebrow. "You mean it made you uncomfortable?" "Yes," Richard admitted, without hesitation, and ashamed. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I watched you give more to my son than I ever had, and I stood there, paralyzed. You had nothing, and you gave freely. I had everything, and I gave nothing." Zoe swallowed. "You said that people choose to be homeless," she reminded him. "I know, and I regret those words more than you can imagine." She looked at him for a long moment, searching for deception. But what she saw wasn't a performance. It wasn't PR polish. It was remorse. Quiet, real, hard-earned. He wasn't just a man trying to salvage his image. He was a man trying to become someone else entirely. "I want to change this company," Richard said. "Not with slogans, not with charts, but by tearing out the roots of the problem. And I want your help to do it." Zoe's mouth opened slightly. "You want me to work with you?" she said, incredulous. "I want you to lead the change. I want you at the table." Zoe shook her head slowly, almost laughing. "You really think bringing in a black woman from the streets is going to fix all this?" "No," Richard replied, "but I think it's the only place to start." The news exploded across the city the next morning. Montgomery Enterprises CEO removes diversity chief after whistleblower revelations. Scarf lady to lead corporate reform efforts. Zoe Williams, from homeless advocate to boardroom powerhouse. For some, it was inspiring. For others, threatening. Inside Montgomery Enterprises, the changes were swift and uncompromising. Hundreds of hiring practices audited. Anonymous surveys exposed a toxic undercurrent within many departments. The old guard, Executives who had quietly enforced the status quo found themselves suddenly obsolete. And at the center of it all, Zoe. She didn't care about fancy titles or corner offices. She demanded change. She implemented a reverse interview process where executives had to be approved by panels of frontline employees, janitors, assistants, customer service reps. She introduced equity audits that evaluated department heads not just on 6 months after the forum, Montgomery Enterprises was no longer the same company. At first glance, the marble floors still gleamed, the reception still boasted the same cascading orchids, and the elevator still whispered in velvet silence. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted, like tectonic plates grinding into a new formation. And at the center of that shift was Zoe Williams. No longer an outsider, she now held the title of Director of Social Impact. But the title meant little to her. What mattered was what she could do with it. Every morning, Zoe walked through the glass doors in the same scuffed boots she had worn in the shelters. She refused a private office. She met interns and assistants by name. Her calendar was split between boardroom meetings and weekly field visits to the very neighborhoods Montgomery Enterprises had once displaced. Her rise was no PR stunt, it was a reckoning. And yet not everyone celebrated it. In a corner office several floors above, a group of middle-aged executives sat in an uneasy silence. "She's a symbol, not a solution." "She's dismantling our model," another hissed. "She's making us look guilty." They weren't wrong. Zoe had become a mirror held up to decades of hidden rot. The glossy charity galas, the polished brochures, the diversity awards, all exposed as window dressing. But what they didn't realize was that she wasn't there to burn the place down. She was there to redesign it from the inside out. And that terrified them more. Meanwhile, James Peterson had all but vanished from the public eye. Lawsuits had been filed. Anonymous testimonies from former employees poured into legal offices and advocacy groups. News outlets released internal memos, audio clips, and damning HR correspondence. Peterson's name became synonymous with performative activism and corporate hypocrisy. He tried to rebrand. No one would hire him. He tried to start a podcast. No one listened. In an irony lost to no one, the man who once told Zoe she didn't fit the image was now a ghost in an industry he once ruled. One headline summed it up perfectly. The gatekeeper locked himself out. But Zoe didn't spend her days gloating. She spent them building. One afternoon, she stood inside a new community tech hub opened on the very block where her old shelter had once stood. The same block the city had renovated to make room for upscale cafes. This center wasn't temporary, it wasn't decorative, it was permanent, and it belonged to the community. Kids were learning coding and robotics. Single mothers were training in remote work programs. Formerly incarcerated men were writing resumes with mentors. Zoe watched them all with quiet pride, but her peace was shattered when a familiar voice said, "You don't remember me, do you?" She turned. A woman stood there clutching a small notebook. "I was at St. Bridget's once, 3 years ago. You gave me the last piece of your sandwich. You said I needed it more than you did. I never forgot." Zoe's heart clenched. Today, that same woman was about to start a paid internship at the new hub. The ripple effect of a forgotten sandwich had come full circle. At a board meeting days later, Zoe rolled out a new proposal, one that sent a chill through the room. "We're creating an external audit committee with independent investigators. No more internal evaluations." There was silence. "And starting next quarter, Executive bonuses will be tied to inclusion metrics verified by this committee." Richard leaned back in his chair, lips twitching into a smile. Some groaned. Others paled. But no one dared challenge her directly because they knew the public trusted her more than they trusted the company. And Richard, he supported her fully. Once, he had built his empire on performance and perception. Now, he was helping her build one on truth. That night, Richard sat on the balcony of his apartment. 1 year after the scandal that rocked Montgomery Enterprises, a glossy issue of Forbes landed on desks across the country. The cover showed two people standing side by side in front of a red brick community center. Zoe Williams, dressed in a crisp navy blazer, hand gently resting on a child's shoulder. And beside her, in a simple gray sweater and jeans, stood Richard Montgomery, smiling, relaxed, unguarded. The headline read, "From Privilege to Purpose: How a Homeless Woman Redefined a Billion-Dollar Empire." Inside the magazine, the interview was candid. "The first time I saw Zoe," Richard said, "she was kneeling on the sidewalk, helping my son while I stood frozen with fear. She gave more in that moment than I had in years." Zoe's quote was even more pointed. "He had the money, I had the humanity. Now we're trying to build something where you don't have to choose between the two." The story became a sensation. Universities taught it in business ethics classes. Nonprofits cited it in fundraising pitches. HR departments adopted the Zoe framework, a radical hiring protocol that filtered in the voices long excluded. And the most astonishing change? Montgomery Enterprises became a model of reparation through reform, not perfect, but honest. Over 200 formerly homeless individuals had been hired through the Project Handkerchief initiative, a program now expanded to 6 states. Each participant received transitional housing, training, and long-term mentorship. No more press release philanthropy. This was structural change. One evening, as autumn leaves swept through the city like amber rain, Zoe stood at the edge of a rooftop garden built on the former site of a luxury condo project that had been halted by community protests. It was now a public space, free to all. Children played, elderly couples strolled, musicians performed under string lights. She watched quietly, her hands buried in her pockets. A small voice piped up beside her. "I brought you something," Noah said, holding up a folded piece of cloth. It was another handkerchief, white, soft, monogrammed with her initials in gold thread. "This one's for the next person," he said. Zoe knelt and hugged him. "You're going to change the world one day, Noah." He pulled back, squinting. "But I'm just a kid." "That's what I thought once too." Richard watched from a distance, his eyes softer than anyone had seen in years. He approached her with quiet footsteps. "She calls you Mama Zoe at school. She won't say it in front of you because she thinks it's silly. But every time a kid falls or cries, she tells them you know how to fix things." Zoe smiled. "Maybe I do." But her eyes were serious. "I don't want this to stop with us, Richard. This isn't redemption. This is just the beginning." He nodded. "It won't stop, because now I see the world you were always trying to survive in." She turned to face him fully. "And do you finally understand what privilege means?" "Yes. It's not just about what I had, it's about what I've never had to question." A week later, Zoe gave the TED Talk that would go viral within 72 hours. The title, "The Most Powerful People Are the Ones Who Were Ignored." People think injustice is loud, she told the audience, but often it's silent. A door that never opens, a smile that never reaches your eyes, a resume that gets tossed because of a name. "I used to think I was broken because I didn't fit the mold. Now I know the mold was never made for people like me." The crowd stood before she even finished. The transformation reached far beyond New York. Other corporations followed suit. Laws were passed mandating transparency in hiring. Cities revisited policies that criminalized homelessness. Shelters partnered with businesses for job pipelines. The phrase handkerchief moment entered the cultural lexicon, a way to describe a small act of compassion that sparks systemic change. In schools, teachers told the story of the scarf lady and the boy, and in homes, children started carrying small white cloths with them just in case someone needed help. 1 year to the day of the forum, Zoe stood before a new class of Project Handkerchief recruits.